I ran out of beer, so I had to switch to wine for this episode. But first things first, there are an obnoxious amount of good edge rushers in this class. I think I went through 45 total names and ended up with 34 with draftable grades, which is almost double the amount of defensive tackles that we had in the first episode. So this is probably going to end up being the longest position group with the most names and the most film that we have to go through. I have no idea how long this is going to be, but probably really fucking long. So, settle in for that. It's going to be a big one. But I did truly feel like we had to talk about all these guys in some capacity. Again, it's going to be tier 1 through tier 5, just like defensive tackle. Tier 1 being the best players, tier 5 being not bad players, still definitely going to be drafted, but just maybe not as complete as the tiers above them. But regardless, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. We got to jump into this thing because we have a ton of names to go over. So up first, of course, is tier 1. I'm going to get this out of the way up front. It is perfectly possible, contrary to popular belief, that Will Anderson is not the first edge rusher taken in the draft. In fact, I have it on good authority that a lot of teams have fairly equivalent grades to all 4 players that I have here in my tier 1, which are Will Anderson, Tyree Wilson, Nolan Smith, and Myles Murphy. There is no clear edge 1 in this class, and there's no clear order for how and where they're going to come off the board. We can reasonably assume that it's going to be within the first 10 to 15 picks, more likely the top 10 picks, but I think it would be a little short-sighted just to guarantee that Will Anderson's going to be the first one. Now, all that being said, I am going to start with Will Anderson because I, like most people, have a very, very high grade on him, and the top 5 hype is absolutely warranted. But going into it, I think that people maybe misunderstand his fit from a scheme perspective, because there's a lot of teams that honestly don't fit Will Anderson that well considering his role and skill set. Looking at how Alabama used him last year specifically, they kind of treated him like a lot of Big 12 teams treat their edge rushers, in the sense that even though he's only 250 pounds, they lined him up at 5 technique and 4-eye a lot. And that's not really his natural position. He's not going to play that in the NFL because he would get absolutely run over. He would get completely crushed. And to be honest, there's a lot of reps of him getting crushed at 5 technique or 4-eye in college too. So I do think that Alabama did him a little bit of a disservice just from the role that he was playing. But if we look at pure edge reps, I do think that he's most at home as like a wide, weak side edge rusher that really focuses more on rushing the passer than anything else. And that could be from a 3-point stance, a 4-point stance, 2-point stance. I don't really think it matters whether he's like a true linebacker or a hand-in-the-dirt defensive end. That particular part doesn't matter to me. It's more about where he is in the defensive front and how wide he is. His first step is really good. His speed to power, especially for a 250-pounder, is really good. And his hand placement and just general technique is awesome. But he does have a little bit of stiffness in his hips. So I think coming from a wider alignment where the corner is, let's just say it's a little bit more forgiving, I think that would be better for a rusher that has his type of physical skill set, in the sense that he's not the bendiest guy, but he's got a good first step, he's got good hand placement. He can kind of shorten the corner with all the little Euro step kind of moves that he does at the top of his rush. I just think that that's kind of where he's going to be at his best as a pass rusher. If you're making him play 6 technique, or if you're lining him up, a little bit more narrow to the tackle, I don't necessarily think that would fit his rush style well, because you need a lot of bend to pull off those tighter alignments, and I just don't think he has that. In terms of role, this is going to sound super weird, but just go with me on it. If you remember Jason Babin way back in the day, when he would basically just play a wide 9, and they would say, Jason, go rush the passer every single play. That, to me, is the type of role that I see for Will Anderson. It doesn't mean that he can't play against the run. He obviously can. He's a good run defender. But I really kind of just want him to be in hunt mode at all times. And when it comes to like integrity of a team run defense, that B-gap area, if we have a 3 technique set to him and we're playing an underfront, that's not going to matter as much. But even if it does, I kind of want to just make run defense the Will's problem and the weak side safety's problem. And the only thing that I want Will Anderson to do is go crush quarterbacks. That's it. Don't drop in coverage. Don't stack and shed against the run. Just scream off the edge in the C gap every single play and go get sacks. He can absolutely do that at a high level in the NFL. He can be a double-digit sack type of guy. I 100% believe that. And there are teams out there, by the way, that need that role filled. Like Yannick Ngakoue has filled that type of role his entire career. There's a bunch of teams that would love to have Yannick Ngakoue. And Will Anderson can maybe be Yannick Ngakoue, but maybe even better. So again, he's going to go high. He's going to go top 5 to 10-ish. I don't necessarily know if he's going to be the first edge taken because I do think it's a little bit more narrow of a skill set. But I will say that his skill set that he does have is super valuable. So still going to be a top pick, still a great player. But I do think that the next edge I'm talking about here, Tyree Wilson, could potentially go ahead of him. Looking at Wilson's skill set, he is quite possibly the most versatile defensive lineman in this entire class. You can line him up as a 5 technique because he's 6'5", 270 plus, and I think he could very easily carry 280 on that frame and be just fine. So he could play 5 technique. Like, you can stand him up as an outside linebacker, and his first step from a 2-point stance is still really good. Obviously, he could play 6 technique and just dominate tight ends against the run. You can make him that weak side edge rusher, just like Will Anderson, and say, go hunt quarterbacks all day. He has the burst and the bend to eventually get there. Even though Will Anderson's technical development is way further ahead of Tyree Wilson right now as a rusher, I think if you teach and mold Tyree Wilson and give him the technique that Will Anderson has, he has a lot better tools than Will Anderson, so he could potentially be better in that role over time. But just in general, looking at Tyree Wilson and all the different roles that he could play, 5 technique, 6 technique, put him out at wide 9, stand him up, whatever stance you want. You could even give him a couple reps inside as like a 3 technique on clear pass rush downs. I'm not saying against the run, but very clear, like 3rd and 9 pass rush situations, put him inside on a guard. He's way too quick for most guards to handle. The fact that you can line him up almost anywhere means to me that his ceiling is way higher as a player, even if the floor right now is lower than Will Anderson. He just has an incredibly rare combination of burst and length and fluidity, and he is already a very good run stopper, by the way. Like, he uses that length and strength really well against the run. There are some reps, especially against TCU. He took on Steve Avila, who was pulling towards him, and he just fucking flattened Steve Avila, who's, could potentially be the first true guard taken in this class. He could be a first-round pick, and he just steamrolled him. So, like, it's a rare athletic ball of clay that we're talking about here. He could go astronomically high. And quite frankly, if he got past the Seahawks at this point, assuming, something weird doesn't happen with the quarterbacks, if Anthony Richardson's off the board and Tyree Wilson got past the Seahawks, honestly, I would be a little bit stunned because I think he's perfect for what they want and need. And I think that specifically in Seattle with that coaching staff, he could maybe eventually be their own version of Myles Garrett. That's the type of talent we're talking about here. So I know, again, this sounds hot takey, but just don't be that shocked if Tyree Wilson is the first edge taken. I'm not saying he will be, because it's very possible that some other team takes Will Anderson in the top 5. We know there are teams out there that have astronomical grades on him, but just depending on what happens with the quarterbacks, if 4 quarterbacks go back to back to back to back to back in the top 4, and it's coming down to Tyree Wilson or Will Anderson at 5, I truly think that Tyree Wilson fits Seattle better, and he could be the first edge. So just keep that in your back pocket. I'm fully prepared to get roasted for that take, but I really do believe that he is that good. Now, moving on to our next edge rusher here in Tier 1, we have Nolan Smith, who is a way different profile than the last 2 guys. Nolan is obviously on the smaller side, even smaller than Will Anderson. But what he lacks in size, he makes up for with just ridiculous, like historically good explosiveness and bend and burst and everything that makes a speed rusher dangerous. Nolan Smith has that. He's getting a lot of comparisons to Hassan Reddick, who now that he's finally a full-time edge rusher and not like a quasi inside linebacker that occasionally gets to rush the passer, looking at you, Arizona. Now that Reddick is actually a full-time edge and we get to see what he can do as a full-time pass rusher, Nolan Smith is getting a lot of comps to Reddick, and I kind of see it. I truly do believe that he has that type of ceiling to be like a 13 to 15 sack type of player, because quite frankly, that kind of burst and bend is tough for any tackle to handle. There's very few tackles in the league, either right or left, that have the kind of explosiveness in their kick set necessary to get to those landmarks and kind of close off the corner before Nolan Smith can get there. It's a very rare athlete we're talking about here. So even though, he's not going to have the speed to power that Will Anderson does, or that Tyree Wilson does, or that Myles Murphy does, the fact that he can get to the corner faster than all but like 8 or 9 tackles in the league, that makes him a legitimate threat. And then you throw in the fact that he's got crazy bend, he's got good feet, like you can drop him in coverage and he's going to be just fine out there because he runs 4.3. He's really good against the run, like almost unnaturally good for his size. He shouldn't be able to stack and shed like he does, but I mean, he's a freaking dog against the run, which I guess makes sense because he went to Georgia, and you can't play at Georgia unless you're good against the run. But he's just a true 3-down player in every sense of the word. And off the field, I mean, his character is unimpeachable. Like, he is seen as the leader of the entire Georgia program, or at least he was while he was there. And everything that I've heard about him in interviews, every single team fell in love. I'm talking immediately. He is seen as one of the best leaders at any position in this entire draft class, and to be honest, in any draft class. He's the type of rare guy who could step in and be a captain as a rookie. So the fact that you take that kind of football character and you combine it with freak athleticism and his ability to be a true 3-down player, first, second, and third down, and play special teams, he's just a very rare player. And if he got out of the top 10 to 12 picks, I would be, quite frankly, stunned by that. I think the Texans at 12 are his absolute floor, assuming the Texans take a quarterback at 2. I don't think Nolan Smith gets past Houston at 12, and to be honest, he probably doesn't get past Philly at 10. He is a phenomenal player. Wherever he goes, that fan base is going to love him immediately, and he's going to play for a really, really long time. Now, rounding out Tier 1 here, we have Myles Murphy from Clemson, who I fully realize he's the most polarizing player in this tier, and I understand why his 2022 tape was honestly just okay. I didn't think that his 2022 was as good as Lucas Van Ness or Keon White or Will McDonald or a lot of the Tier 2 edge rushers we're going to get into in a little bit. But I was told by a friend, hey, go back and watch 2021. That's really the year that a lot of teams are kind of banking on here, and why a lot of teams have him as roughly equivalent grades to the other guys in this tier. So I said, okay, I'm going to go watch and see what the teams have seen. And when I dug into 2021, which again, Brent Venables was still at Clemson, it was kind of the same thing that has oddly happened to a lot of the Clemson products that I've watched this year, or at least this draft season, which is that all of them played better in 2021 than 2022. Shocker, I know, Brent Venables is a good DC. Who knew? But it really is kind of crazy how much better Murphy's tape was 2 years ago than last year. He's a 6'5", 270-pound edge rusher that plays the run like a freaking maniac. He's really hard to dig out on the line of scrimmage, and his first step and bend are really underrated to me. He's a better football player than tester. I think his testing numbers were really underwhelming, but again, if you go back and you watch him on tape, I think his first step is better than a 31-inch vertical suggests. I think his bend is better than a 7.21 3-cone suggests. So you're kind of trusting the tape over the numbers on this one, and I know that scares a lot of people, and it's probably why he's going to be the 4th out of these Tier 1 edge rushers selected. But again, if we're just looking at the tape, he was an overwhelming edge rusher for most of that 2021 season. The speed to power was damn near unblockable. He had really great hand fighting skills in terms of like how he would neutralize a tackle's punch and kind of, clear his chest to shorten the corner. He was very good technically as a pass rusher. He was great on stunts, and especially kind of using that power to set up loopers behind him. Like I mentioned, dominant against the run. Pretty much the only thing he can't and won't do is drop into coverage because he's 6'5", 270. But other than that, I mean, he was a dominant player that year. I fully do acknowledge that this is a much riskier pick than everyone else in Tier 1, and honestly, it's riskier than a lot of the guys in Tier 2 as well. But if we're swinging for the fences and we're trying to get a big defensive end whose tape looks like Max Crosby, at least in 2021 it did, Myles Murphy's the guy that we're going for. Whether you personally would take Murphy, super high in the draft, it just depends on how risky or safe you want to be. But again, I cannot stress this enough. There are teams out there right now that are ready to risk it all for Myles Murphy. They see him as potentially a superstar, and I totally understand why. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that all the names in Tier 1 are probably going to go in the top 15-ish picks, if not higher than that. They could all even be top 10 picks. I wouldn't be surprised. But what really excites me about this edge class is really the Tier 2 guys, because there's so many of them. For starters, there's 9 names in Tier 2, and individually, all of them have arguments to be first-round picks. And in most edge classes, to be honest, they'd probably be top 20-ish, maybe top 25 picks, and half of them are going to go in the second round just because of how deep this edge class is. So in terms of getting value at edge, Tier 2 is where it's at. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. They all have different scheme fits, and we will get into that when we dive into the tape. And I really can't wait to kind of, parse that out with you guys. Just keep in mind, you can put them in whatever order you want to. I don't really think it matters. They're all really good, and they all have very different fits. So we will get into their tape in just 1 second. But before I do that, I want to remind you that if you're like me and you get really busy, maybe you're putting out draft content right now and you don't have time to eat like a normal human, because I don't have time to eat like a normal human. And, maybe you throw a TV dinner in the microwave every now and then. Maybe you do some frozen meals. If you're like that and you're trying to save time and energy during draft season, but you don't want to eat complete garbage, I think Factor is for you. All Factor meals arrive pre-prepared and ready to eat in just 2 minutes, which again is perfect for weeks like this one, where I'm probably pulling 75 to 80-ish hours this week with only about 10 or 11 days to go until the draft, so I just don't have any spare time at all. And by the way, their menus are updated weekly, and those include 27-plus meal options and 33-plus add-on options, and those include keto choices, calorie smart, chef's choice, or even vegan or vegetarian meals as well, so it works for pretty much any dietary preference. And the only thing that I really want to emphasize here is also probably the most important thing, and that's that this food is legitimately good. I know that we've been trained throughout our lives to believe that microwavable meals are just supposed to be tolerable for the sake of convenience, but these meals are actually really, really tasty. Probably because they all come freshly prepared and they're not frozen and packed with preservatives. It tastes like real food because it is actual real food made with real ingredients. So if you're looking for some quick food options to get you through a busy day, but you want to eat something that will actually taste good, I think Factor is definitely worth giving a try to see if you like it too. And if you do want to try it out, by the way, you can use my promo code by heading to factor75.com or click the link below and use promo code FILMROOM50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Again, that is factor75.com or click the link below and use promo code FILMROOM50, and that will get you 50% off your first Factor box. Thank you again to Factor for sponsoring this week's show, and with that, let's get to Tier 2. Leading us off in this tier, we have Lucas Van Ness from Iowa, who to me is the poster child for ball of clay that you really want to work with. He's coming out after only being a redshirt sophomore at Iowa, and even then he didn't start any games at Iowa last year because for whatever reason they kind of just prioritize, seniors play first, guys that have been around the program for a long time play first, and then they would work in Van Ness as a rotational player, even though he was better than literally everybody else on that defensive line by a lot, in my opinion. But whatever, I'm not going to tell Iowa how to run their program. They had an elite defense regardless, so it ended up not really mattering. But anyway, Lucas Van Ness as a prospect in a vacuum is utterly absurd. Just like Miles Murphy and Tyree Wilson, he's 6'5", 270 plus pounds. He has 34-inch arms, a 10 split of 164, which at that size is crazy. And even crazier, his 3-cone, again at 6'5", 270 plus, was 702. Typically, a sub-7 3-cone is going to be the best indicator for how bendy an edge rusher is. But if you're 270 and you're right at that 7-second mark on 3-cone, that means that your hips and overall fluidity are just straight up abnormal. And that shows up on tape too. Like, it's not just, me scouting testing numbers. Like, if you watch him on tape, he does things from a balance and fluidity standpoint that you just really don't see from guys his size. Like, his change of direction ability at 270 plus, it's just not something you see every day. And so even though I have him in tier 2 because there's just not as much tape from him as a lot of other guys in this class, again, coming out after a redshirt sophomore season, and he was a rotational player even on his own defense, if we're just looking at the tape that we do have and the production that we do have and, the numbers that we do have, he could potentially be an absolute force in the NFL. I'm talking from day one. You want him at 6 technique, he can do that. You want him at 5 technique and an odd front, he can probably do that. Like put on 10 pounds, his frame can take it, and he'll be an elite 5 technique in my opinion. Iowa even put him at 3 technique. Like they put him at 3 a lot more than Texas Tech put Tyree Wilson at 3. And I'm not gonna lie, again, if we put on like 20 pounds and we made him at 290, he'd probably be a really damn good full-time 3 technique as well. His strength, his power, his explosiveness, his bend, it's all just crazy, crazy stuff. And like I alluded to earlier, if he hits his ceiling, like if he hits what we think he can be, he might be better than Miles Murphy. He might be better than Nolan Smith or even, Tyree Wilson or Will Anderson. I absolutely see a future where that is possible. But again, we just have to be aware there's not as much tape from him. There's not as big a sample size. He is really young, but the talent is indisputable. He's another one of these guys that I think could go as early as maybe to the Eagles at 10, Texans at 12. I mean, the Patriots would love him at 14. He just screams Patriot to me. And I really don't think that he would get past a team like the Steelers at 17, just because he would be such an immense value at that point. Even if he's not entirely what they normally look for in terms of their defensive linemen, I think that, you just look at the package that he has and the talent that he has and you say, fuck it, we'll build a defense that fits Lucas Van Ness. Like Steelers at 17 is the floor for me. He's not getting past there. So again, phenomenal player, crazy talent, and I really can't wait to see where he goes. Now, next up we have Keon White from Georgia Tech, who at least to me is a very similar prospect to Lucas Van Ness, and I think teams that like Van Ness are probably going to like Keon White as well. Except he's even bigger than Van Ness, and I think is even more proven as like a hybrid inside-outside tweener because he's 6'5", 285. So I think you can see a future where he plays even more 3 technique than Van Ness, but at minimum, I think he'd make a really phenomenal 5 technique and even a 6 technique for like a 4-down front because he is really explosive. He's not as bendy as Van Ness, like he doesn't turn the corner as quickly, so I think Van Ness, might go earlier because of that. But in terms of like straight line vertical explosiveness, Keon White has the edge on Van Ness. He's got dynamite in his hands. He's an elite run stopper, both outside and inside in this class. And that destructive explosiveness, I mean, it really lends itself well for like stunts and games and all that kind of stuff, because if you can cave in a guard or cave in a center and just make the path that much wider for somebody to loop or twist around you if it's a linebacker coming, that's a really valuable skill set for a lot of defenses as well that kind of rely more on scheme to get pressure than just straight up rushing for and saying, go win. I don't necessarily think that Keon White is the guy that you put him at 3 technique and you give him a 2-way go and you say, go beat the guard for a sack. I don't really think that's his forte. Doesn't mean that he can't do it. Van Ness is probably better there, but in terms of flexibility of position, where you can play 5 technique, 3 technique, 6 technique, whatever, the ability to stop the run, the ability to set up stunts and games at a really, really high level because he's so damn strong, and the fact that his motor never quits. He's a very high motor player. I just think there's a lot to like here, and I personally believe that a lot of draft media has gotten too caught up in what he doesn't do well, and they haven't focused enough on what he does do well. And typically teams, they'll grade a player and they'll draft a player for what they do well because they know that they can create a scheme that minimizes what they don't. So for me, I'm prioritizing the positives of the skill set because I know that the negatives in all likelihood will be minimized. That's just what good coaches do. So Keon White, very good player. Again, could potentially go as early as 14 to the Patriots. Would not be surprised by that at all. And really his range goes all the way down to even Kansas City at 31. So there's a lot of different possibilities there for him to go in the first round, if not the top of the second round. He's a very, very good player, and in my opinion, a very undervalued player. Next up, we have Will McDonald from Iowa State, who's one of my personal favorites in this class, and I think he should be a lock to go in the first round because of how damn athletic he is. But he, unfortunately, is a victim of Big 12 defense-itis, which a lot of the guys in this class are. And what I mean by that is he's a 265-pound edge rusher who played at 260, and Iowa State made him play 5 technique. It's the same thing we heard from Will Anderson. It happened to Dylan Horton, Felix Anudike-Uzomah from Kansas State. All these defensive coordinators that, really want to play odd fronts and just have 3-man rushes and drop 8 into coverage because they think that's the only way to stop the fucking spread. It did all of these edge prospects no favors. You got 250, 255, 260-pound guys playing 5 technique. That's never going to do that in the NFL. He will never be a 5 technique in the NFL. Most 5 techniques are like 285 to 300 pounds in the NFL. McDonald ain't doing that. He's going to be a true edge rusher because he is crazy explosive, crazy bendy. He's going to actually get true pass rush opportunities, which he didn't get very many at Iowa State. But when he did get actual pass rush opportunities at Iowa State, he was really damn good at it. His pass rush win rate was exceptional, again, on the actual true pass rush reps that he had, where he wasn't just, on a 3-man rush stunting from a 5 technique spot where, you're just playing coverage. You're not expecting him to actually get sacks. But on his actual, true opportunities, he won a lot. He was ultra productive considering that. And then he went down to the Senior Bowl and he just toasted everybody because he finally got to actually rush the passer. At the Combine, he actually came in lighter than his playing weight. He dropped down to 6'4", 240 because he really wanted to emphasize the point that, hey, I'm an outside linebacker, I'm a stand-up edge. And he put on a show. I mean, his 3-cone was 6'8'5", which is just gnarly. Like, the bend and the fluidity that you have to pull off a 6'8'5" at 240 pounds, that's just rare stuff. And his first step, again, was validated by the vert. It was 36-inch vert, 11-foot broad. That shows up on tape. He has just a wicked first step, again, when he's actually allowed to rush. And we do see a variety of pass rush moves in his arsenal as well. So I think Will McDonald is one of the more undervalued edge players in this class, simply because there wasn't a whole lot of translatable tape to the NFL. But NFL teams know that. They know that he's going to be a stand-up edge for them, very similar to Nolan Smith. But if you don't get Nolan Smith in the top 12 picks, you can still get Will McDonald somewhere in the back half of the first round. And I truly think that he has potential to be just as good. Nolan Smith is obviously the safer bet, but Will McDonald is not that far behind. So for me, I think that he's absolutely a first-round talent. I think he will go somewhere in the top 31 picks. And if he got past Kansas City at 31, honestly, I'd be really surprised because they desperately need a rusher like him, more on the explosive, bendy side. They have a whole bunch of big, hulking rushers that compress the pocket. They need somebody that can win with speed and flash, and that's Will McDonald. So, great player. I definitely think he's going to be a first-rounder, and probably a darn good one at that. Next up on our list, we have Byron Young from Tennessee. I know there are 2 Byron Youngs in this class. One's from Bama and one's from Tennessee. And to make matters worse, they were both on the same Senior Bowl roster. So it was extremely confusing. But we're talking about the Tennessee Byron Young here. And I think he's somewhat similar to Will McDonald, but a much different build, even though I think he'll play a similar role. Unlike McDonald, Byron Young is kind of on the smaller side. He's 6'2", still 250 pounds, but with much shorter arms. He's got 32.5-inch arms. So I think that he can't necessarily win the same way that McDonald does, because McDonald has such exceptional length and power that he can kind of win with that fastball just going right through a tackle's chest. Whereas Byron Young, I think he's going to struggle with that a little bit. But that being said, I do think that Byron is even more explosive and more, slippery, I would say, than Will McDonald, who already is an exceptionally bendy rusher himself. I think that Young's first step, and very similar to Nolan Smith, his ability to get to that landmark at the corner and then dip and flip his hips and get around it, it's very, very special. And I think that he has like top tier NFL burst. But where I really see it show up the most is on stunts and games. His ability to, almost teleport from the edge and then loop around inside and get to the lane before a center or a guard can react, it's really, really rare stuff. And I think that he is one of the most deadly rushers as the finisher on stunts, not necessarily the one who sets it up, because again, not having as much length and power means you're not as good at setting up the pins. But in terms of knocking them down and, using that burst and agility and fluidity to, get through the gap and close space quickly, he is one of the most rare guys in this class at doing that. So I think on defenses that, really prioritize doing all these crazy stunts on third downs and just having as much speed on the field as possible so that offensive linemen can't react, they're going to love a guy like Byron Young because he's phenomenal at that. Not to mention that if we are just playing it straight and saying, okay, go line up at like a ghost 9 and just use your speed and bend to win around the corner, he's going to do that as well. I think run defense, not as good as McDonald or Nolan Smith, but if we're just going for a pure flamethrower as a weak side edge rusher, Byron Young is pretty hard to outdo in this class. And I would say similar things about BJ Ojulari, who's next up on this list. He's from LSU, and he's kind of an interesting midpoint between our last two names, being Will McDonald and Byron Young, in the sense that his build is a little bit of a hybrid between them. He's 6'2", 250, so really thick build for that height. He's got kind of that natural leverage that you get from a 6'2" edge rusher, but he has unnatural length for that height. A lot of guys that are 6'2" have, Byron Young's length, like 32.5-inch arms, whereas BJ Ojulari has damn near 34.5-inch arms. So he has crazy unusual length for that build, which kind of puts him in Justin Houston territory of shorter guy, but still kind of a thicker, stronger build. So he has the natural leverage plus with that arm length, so you can really take advantage of that natural leverage and put a tackle on their ass. He doesn't quite have the same first step and bend of McDonald or of Byron Young, but again, I think he makes up for it with variety of pass rush moves, with the fact that he can give you a long arm and convert speed to power. He's got a nifty little ghost move. He's got a spin that he showed. I think he's better against the run than Byron Young as well. And I think that it should be said that he wore 18 at LSU, which is a very, very special number. You don't get to wear 18 unless you have impeccable both football character and off the field character. So I think kind of taking the leadership component into it, the fact that he is a high motor, high effort player all the time, wore a special sacred number at LSU, has the length, has the power, has enough bend and enough burst. I just think he checks a lot of different boxes. And even though he doesn't have, maybe elite traits, I do think that he has enough traits to make me think he's going to be a very productive pass rusher in the NFL and still likely a top 40 pick, if not a first round pick. I don't exactly know where he's going to go because, again, all these guys could start going in the teens to the top of the second round. And it really just depends on what flavor of edge rusher you want. But if he's still there at like pick 40, I'd be very surprised. Now, moving on from Ojulari, I want you to take everything that I just said about him and just copy and paste that over to Derek Hall, because I have virtually identical grades and virtually identical notes for both of them. Hall is another one of these shorter, more compact edge rushers. He's 6'2.5", 254, so a little bit bigger than Ojulari. Still has 34.5-inch arms, still has a ton of power, still has a great first step and bend. It's just basically another Justin Houston type. And it's rare to get that type of profile for an edge rusher. Again, a shorter guy, but with length and power and ability to hold up against the run and has decent hips and, a variety of pass rush moves. Like, that's not a common profile. And we have two of them in the same draft class. That's how insane this edge class is that I have two guys back to back, both could be first round picks, and I'm comparing both of them to one of the most productive pass rushers of a generation, and that's Justin Houston. I think that Hall has just as good of a chance of being a first-round pick as Ojulari, because I think there's a lot of teams that would love to have him as a stand-up edge that isn't a liability against the run. Like, there's some guys in this class that I think would kind of get run over a little bit, and we'll get to them as we get into Tier 3 and Tier 4. Derek Hall is not one of them. Again, he is low to the ground, but he's still 255 pounds and has 34.5-inch arms. It's like running into a Coke machine, okay? Like, you're not going to go anywhere. I think that Hall, for whatever reason, just hasn't gotten as much media attention as maybe he would in most years, just because this edge class is so deep. But I think he is a very, very underrated player. One of the best edges in this class, one of the safest edges in this class. And again, he's another one of these guys where Kansas City's sitting on the clock at 31. I think they could use some edge help. He gives them a different flavor than they normally take. And he'd be a very fine first-round pick for them and probably be really productive even as a rookie. Speaking of undervalued edges, by the way, that's a pretty good segue to talk about Dylan Horton from TCU, who's next up on our list, and somebody who, believe it or not, has gotten even less press than Derek Hall. And maybe that's the product of being another one of these guys that's from the Big 12, so they're playing a bunch of 3-down fronts and only rushing those 3 guys, and he's playing 5 technique and not getting any true pass rush opportunities. In fact, that's probably a big reason why you don't hear a lot about him, but if you just throw on the tape and you watch his true pass rush reps, he is a nightmare to block. He's a bigger body at about 6'4", 260, so he's got a lot more size than many of the other Tier 2 edges in this class. Great first step, which is backed up by his testing numbers, mid-30s in the vert, 10-foot broad. And even though he is not as bendy as really any of the last few guys we talked about, Will McDonald, Byron Young, B.J. Ojulari, Derek Hall, he doesn't have the hips of any of those 4 guys. But what he does have is just overwhelming power, great hand usage, and a motor that never quits. If I had to compare him to anyone, he really does remind me a lot of Jabal Sheard, if you remember him from like the early to mid 2010s. Similar size guy, Sheard was 6'3", 265, kind of rushed with a similar style where even though he didn't have the same bend, his speed to power was awesome, his hand fighting skills were equally awesome, and he just found a way to win consistently down in and down out. I think Horton absolutely does not get the credit that he deserves for how good of a player he was at TCU in a scheme that did him absolutely no favors. And I think there's a lot of teams, if they're not looking for the lighter, more fluid, quicker edge rusher in the mold of, say, Byron Young, if they want something heavier with a little bit more early down versatility that can play the run, maybe kick him inside a little bit because, at 260, it's pushing it, but you could theoretically do that. And somebody who's just going to give you high effort every single play, and they're going to execute their job every single play. Dylan Horton's going to be for those types of teams. He doesn't quite have the same flashiness in his skill set, but he still wins the same amount. And to me, that's really what matters. I have a lot of similar notes for the next name on our list, by the way, Tuli Tuipulotu from USC. I did go to the USC Pro Day, by the way, recently, but unfortunately, we didn't get any testing numbers from Tuli because he's still nursing a hamstring injury. But to be honest, just watching him on tape, I kind of saw all I needed to see. He's another one of these bigger edge rushers, just like Dylan Horton, so he's 6'3", 265. He does have some inside-outside versatility because earlier in his career at USC, they played him primarily at defensive tackle, and then he shed a little weight, played at 265 at edge. And you can kind of see that interior defensive line skill set show up when he plays the run because he plays it very violently, very physically. Just like Horton, if you're a team that wants, more of a hard edge setter and not just a flamethrower, Tuipulotu is going to be for you. But I do think that he has potential to go even higher than Horton does because, at least on tape, again, we don't have any numbers to back this up because, again, hamstring injury, but at least on tape, I think that he's more fluid than Horton is. Like, I think his hips are a little bit looser. I think his balance through contact is a little bit better. I think he can bend the edge a little bit more. He might not have quite the same speed to power as Horton does. Like, when Horton gets a runway, he can just fucking run through you. I don't know if Tuipulotu quite has that. Doesn't mean his power is bad, but Horton's is just kind of gross. But that being said, I do think that Tuipulotu makes up for it by having more bend, more quickness, more agility, and just more ways to win, right? So I think that, taking that into account, plays the run like a defensive tackle, because he used to play defensive tackle, has enough bend, has enough agility. I think overall the profile is very similar to like a Preston Smith. And if you remember Preston Smith coming out of college, he also was another one of these guys with like inside, outside versatility. Some scouts had him at defensive end. Some thought he should bulk up and play defensive tackle. What ended up happening was he dropped a little bit of weight and played outside linebacker. I think Tuipulotu could potentially do that as well. Maybe get him down to like a lean 260 and then stand him up at edge. And you're still getting that physicality and edge setting ability, as a run defender, but you're giving him even less weight to carry around. So I think, his fluidity and agility would show up even more. I'm not sure if he's going to go in the first round, even though I think it's, potentially possible. There are teams that I think would be interested in him. But again, pick 40, I think, is about the floor for me. If he got past that, I would start to wonder why. Maybe there's an injury thing I'm not aware of, but like pick 40, that seems about fair as the floor for him. Very talented player, very versatile player, and I think there's a lot of teams out there that would have different plans for him depending on if they want him to gain weight or lose weight, but he could go either way. So I love Tuli Tuipulotu. He's one of my favorite edges in this class, simply because I think he has the most possibilities in front of him. Rounding off tier 2 here, we're going to finish this thing off with Felix Anudike-Uzomah from Kansas State, who, once again, tell me if you've heard this story before, he's a 6'3", 255-pound defensive end in the Big 12 that was asked to play 5 technique. Because of course he was. And believe me, I understand why Big 12 staffs do this. They feel like it's their best way of stopping the spread. You get a bunch of guys in coverage, you're running stunts up front with 3. I get it. I fully understand why they do it. But God, for evaluating for the NFL, it just makes things so much harder. Just so much harder because we don't get a lot of reps to look at. Luckily for Anudike-Uzomah, on the few true pass rush reps we got to see, he was very good. And I think that he was highly efficient on those reps, but it's just a sample size issue. So these guys are a lot harder to evaluate. Anybody from K-State, Iowa State, TCU, like Texas is one of the few defenses in the conference that actually translates to the NFL, but most of the Big 12 doesn't play a defense that helps us out as evaluators. Again, I understand why they do it. It's just frustrating. But anyway, back to Anudike-Uzomah. Very productive player. Again, has a similar kind of sawed-off shotgun profile like, say, Bijo Jalari or Derek Hall. He's 6'3", 255 with 33.5-inch arms. So I think he does have that speed-to-power element that a lot of other smaller edges might not, or at least thinner edges might not. I think he can go right through a tackle's chest and kind of generate that push, force a quarterback to step up, and then you shed inside and get the sack that way. So having speed to power as a fastball is a plus, but I also think he has pretty good bend around the corner as well. He did hit that sub 7.3 cone threshold at 6.94, which is not just good, that's great to me at 255. And I do think that bend shows up on tape, especially when he's kind of rounding the corner and finishing on those last few steps where he's low and he's off balance and you kind of got to contort your body to get the sack. I think he showed several times he can do that. So I think overall, looking at his tools, he's got natural leverage because he's shorter, but he still has length, he still has power, and he has bend. And I think if you just miss out on any of the first 6 or 7 edge rushers that get taken in the top 20 picks, and you're looking for somebody in the mid to late 20s or early second round who you're fairly confident is going to be productive, Felix Anudike-Uzomah is going to be at or near the top of the list. And he's another one of these guys where first 10 to 12 picks of the second round is probably his floor. I don't know if he's going to go ahead of Ojulari. I don't know if he's going to go ahead of Hall or Horton or Tuipulotu or Byron Young or even Will McDonald. I have no idea what order all these guys are going to go in, but pretty much from pick 20 to 40, they're all going to go somewhere in there. So just throw a dart and you'll probably be right. Now, if you followed my work for a long time, and I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years at this point on YouTube, and even longer, back when I used to write for SB Nation, a decade ago at this point? It's been a while. You know that I am a longtime proponent of the Batman and Robin theory when it comes to pass rushers, meaning that if you're trying to build a successful pass rush, you need to have a Batman and you need to have a Robin. You can't just have one great pass rusher. You need to have that, extra complementary threat that maybe isn't quite as good, but is still a threat in their own right to get sacks so that you don't just get double teams on Batman every single play. You got to have at least 2 guys. Tier 3 for me in this class is where you're going to find that Robin. These are guys where, they have individual traits that I think are really special that can, be maximized to be productive pass rushers. Maybe they're never going to be a 12-plus sack guy, but year in, year out, you can count on them for between 6 to 9. And that's enough, right? That just makes them a threat. In addition to, maybe bringing some other tools as well. Maybe they're really good in coverage. Maybe they're really good in run defense. Maybe they're a special teams demon, whatever it happens to be. This is the tier where you find the complementary pass rusher / role player that really fills out a modern NFL defense, because you can't have stars everywhere, right? You just got to get solid players at some positions. And everybody in tier 3, to me, is a really solid player. We're going to start off this tier with a player that I am almost certainly higher on than the vast majority of draft media, and I'm perfectly okay with that, and that is Nick Hampton from App State. If you're familiar with Hampton, it's because A, you either watch a lot of Sun Belt football, or B, you recognize his name from Bruce Feldman's annual Freaks list, which he very much deserved his placement on that. And if you're not familiar with the Freaks list, that's the annual list of like the 20 or so freakiest college football players in the country. And Hampton got on that list because he's 6'2", 240, jumps 39 inches, runs sub 4.6, and hit 21 miles per hour on the GPS, mind you. He also incline presses 365 and sumo deadlifts 600 pounds. He may only be 240, but he packs a serious punch at that size. And all that athleticism really shows up on tape, too. To be honest, if you miss out on Nolan Smith, I really don't think that Nick Hampton is that far behind, especially athletically. And even though Nolan Smith is a lot better against the run, in terms of pass rush prowess, Hampton's right there for me. His first step is insane. He's extremely fluid and has a ton of bend. He has a wide variety of pass rush moves that he puts on display. And even though obviously he's not the best power rusher, he does have some power as a pass rusher. Just obviously at 240 pounds, there's only so much you can do against a 320-pound offensive tackle. His game is going to be very similar to, like I mentioned earlier, Nolan Smith and Hassan Reddick, where it's more about speed and fluidity than anything else. And because he can get to that corner faster than most other rushers, not just in college football, but faster than most other rushers in the league, because he can get to that landmark and that depth quicker than the vast majority of humans alive, he's going to be able to put that bend and fluidity to work, and I think that his lack of size isn't going to hurt him that much. Plus, if you go back to early in his career at App State, I mean, he came into that program at 200 pounds. He was rail thin back then, but he added 40 over his college career and came out at 240. But I still think there's room that he could add even more weight to his frame, so I'm not discounting that he could get up to like a 6'2", 250-pound frame, which is honestly pretty good. Like, that'll be fine in the NFL. He still has length, he still has burst, he still has bend. If he just adds like 10 more pounds of healthy weight, I don't think that people are going to be that concerned about his size. So it's kind of the same thing with Nolan Smith. They might be slender now, but it doesn't mean they're going to be slender when they're like 25 or 26 years old. Overall, I really do love Nick Hampton as a pass rusher. He'll be a rotational rusher as a rookie that can kind of grow into a wider role as he kind of keeps going in his career. But for now, if you need a flamethrower off the edge and you miss out on some of the top guys in this class, Nick Hampton's really who you want. Now, moving on from Hampton, I want to talk about Zach Harrison from Ohio State and Isaiah Foskey from Notre Dame at the same time, because they are roughly the same profile to me. And if you're somewhere in the third or fourth round and you're looking for a bigger, thicker, longer edge that's going to be really good against the run, and they're going to use that length and power to compress the pocket rather than bend the edge, Harrison and Foskey are who you're looking for. Now, when you take a peek around the NFL and you look at your typical 10-plus sack type of pass rusher, most of those guys are going to have sub-7 or at least very close to sub-7 three-cones, because the three-cone at the combine is going to generally have the highest correlation between bendier, flexible pass rushers that can finish a rep and get around the corner and get low and flatten that angle to get a sack. Three-cone times are really important for pass rushers. And unfortunately for Harrison and Foskey, they really don't have good bend, and I think that was reflected in their three-cone time because they both ran it at around 7.3. So they're 0.3 of a second off the general threshold that you're looking for, which is a lot. Like, that's a really big number, and it's not a number that you're looking for. And again, looking at them on tape, you really see that lack of bend every time they rush. They can't get low. Their contact balance when a tackle's leaning on them is really poor. They don't have the ability to kind of rescue a rep that they're losing with bend or balance and still kind of like, just flatten themselves around the corner when they're getting pushed behind the pocket. They really have to have everything line up for them to get a sack. In terms of shortening the corner, they can use their length and power to kind of generate force, get the tackle back, and shorten that angle that they're going to have to run. And you can have success doing that in the NFL. There's plenty of guys that do have success doing that in the NFL and being that kind of power rusher that makes the corner softer. But it's a hard living, and I think that skill set generally is more for complementary pass rushers, guys that you expect to get somewhere around 6 to 9 sacks, and not guys that you think could turn into, like, well, Batman. Now, I will say that their length and power does lend itself well to run defense, and I think these are two very good 3-down players. You can put them on the field on 1st and 2nd down and trust that they're going to be at least competent against the run early on as rookies. They have the length, they have the strength, they have the ability to recognize blocks, and they can tell when they're getting down blocked, they can tell when they're getting scoop blocked, and they have the requisite technique to defeat different types of blocks, which probably deserves its own video at some point because the world of defensive line technique is crazy deep and crazy nuanced, but we'll get to that another day. Either way, these are two very good run defenders. They're good power rushers, but I just don't see the potential for them to be double-digit sack guys unless they're just really eating on like stunts and twists and stuff like that, which again is possible, but I don't see a consistent threat of being a double-digit sack type of player. They're very good, very solid. They're just more Robin than Batman. Now, I will say this. I think there is one name in this tier that potentially could be a Batman, meaning just a 3-down ass kicker that, maybe could be a double-digit sack guy, if not early, possibly eventually, in addition to being a great run defender, can play in any system, either from a 2-point stance, 3-point stance, 4-point stance, and that's going to be Jose Ramirez from Eastern Michigan. I absolutely love everything about Jose Ramirez. I actually thought about, maybe sneaking him into tier 2, but I decided against it just because, again, level of competition, when you beat the hell out of directional Michigan schools, it's a lot different than beating the hell out of ACC or Big Ten or SEC guys. So I get it. I wanted to temper my expectations a little bit, but at least on tape, Jose Ramirez is a freaking psychopath. Keep in mind, he led all of college football in sacks, and that was a well-earned title. These were not cleanup sacks. These were not just effort sacks. These weren't schemed up for him, entirely on like stunts and blitzes where he's going unblocked. He was earning these sacks. He won with every single move you can think of. He got people with power. He got people with bend, with speed. He had inside counters. He won every single way. And he won from multiple stances, 2-point stance, 3-point stance, 4-point stance. Like, he's truly scheme-proof to me. You can play him in any defense, and he's going to have a role. And I think he's a good run defender, too. Is he as good against the run as, like, Dylan Horton or Will McDonald or Van Ness or Keon White? No, and that's another reason why I put him at tier 3, because he's not quite those guys, but he's good enough. He's going to set the edge for you, and you're going to be fine. And then he's going to be a really good pass rusher on 3rd down that you don't really have to teach him anything. If you just want a plug-and-play pass rusher that you can get in like the 3rd or 4th round, which is a rare thing, by the way, but this edge class is so deep that you can get him in the 3rd or 4th round. But if you're just looking for a guy that you can give snaps on day 1 and you're not worried about it, Jose Ramirez is that guy in this class for me. It's not often that I project somebody as like potentially an early day 3 pick that I think also could be a 10-sack guy, but eventually I do think Jose Ramirez can get to that point. I really do believe in him that much. He's one of my favorite edges in this class. I just couldn't quite put him into tier 2 because there's a lot of really good edges in this class, and I had to cut it off somewhere. But love Jose. He's going to go a lot higher than people think, and it's a name that you absolutely should pay attention to. We're going to finish off this tier now with a pair of Louisville rushers, and one went to Shrine Bowl, one went to Senior Bowl, and they're both really, really good. And that's Yasir Abdullah and Yaya Diaby, who I think both will be top 150 picks easily. Now, Diaby and Abdullah are both very different players and very different styles. In fact, physically, they're about as different as you can possibly be as well. Diaby is 6'3", 265, and Abdullah is 6 foot 237. So they look very different, but they're both ultra explosive. Diaby, again, at 6'3", 265, is a 37-inch vert, a 10-foot broad, and a 151 10-yard split. That is disgusting. Like, that is all-time 10-yard split at that size. And his athleticism absolutely shows up on tape as well. And Abdullah is not that different. I mean, again, 237, which isn't big, but also isn't tiny. Like 237 is a pretty decent size. He had 36.5 in the vert, 10.9 in the broad, and a 148 10-yard split. So both of these guys had just ridiculous first steps, and Louisville's pass rush and all the pressure they generated last year is probably evidence of that. Most tackles, let alone in college, but even in the NFL, most tackles can't keep up with a first step like that. Unfortunately for Diaby, though, he didn't get quite the same true pass rush opportunities that Abdullah did, and Abdullah put up like 60-plus pressures this year, had a whole lot of sacks. You know, he was kind of like the featured pass rusher in this system, whereas Diaby, he was playing 4-eye, he was playing 5 technique, he was put in a position very similar to a lot of the Big 12 defensive ends we already talked about, where he's not very wide. He's like compressed right in on the tackle, so he doesn't have any runway to work with. He doesn't have any good angles to work with as a pass rusher. He's taking up double teams. He's setting up stunts. He's kind of doing all the dirty work in that system where Abdullah just got to go have fun and kill quarterbacks. But when Diaby did actually get like a couple true pass rush reps, you saw the talent. You saw the burst. You saw the bend. And I think that there is something there to work with. I will say this, he's not as developed from what I can tell compared to Abdullah. Maybe that's a product of the fact that he just didn't get good opportunities, so how could he be developed? And I think that Diaby, rushes more just with power and trying to win with pure athleticism right now than having, any sort of pass rush plan. You're not really seeing him throw moves. He's not cross-chopping people. He's not giving you a ghost move. There's no dip and rip there. There's just not really any pass rush moves to speak of for the most part. But he is still winning. Like, he still got 10 sacks just through pure athleticism and power and being a badass on stunts. So there is something there to work with. He's an incredible athlete. He's probably going to go higher than a bunch of the guys that I already listed, if we're being honest, because the tools are insane. And I think there's a lot of defensive line coaches out there that are like, yeah, I can fix that. And I think that coaching staffs aren't stupid, and they see that he's playing 4-eye and 5 technique, and they know that he didn't get a lot of opportunities. But Yaya Diaby is very, very talented, and somebody you should absolutely pay attention to, because he's going to go way higher than you think. But back to Abdullah for a second. Even though I do think that he's going to go behind Diaby because he doesn't have the prototypical dimensions, I think that he might have one of the best careers out of any of the hybrid off-ball linebacker edge types in this class, because he is so explosive, he is so bendy, and we've seen him do some stuff that even true off-ball linebackers aren't really doing. There was an interception that we saw him get this past year, and when we were at the Shrine Bowl, we actually asked him to break it down, and he did. If you want to go watch that full interview, he broke down the coverage they were in, all the reads he had, techniques he was playing. The way he broke it down was awesome. But to summarize him real quick, their match zone rules had him picking up a wide receiver on a wheel route down the boundary, which is typically not something that you want an edge rusher to be doing. But the fact that he runs literally a 4.47 with crazy burst and crazy bend, that meant that he could pick up a receiver on a wheel route down the boundary, armbar him like he's a corner, and then get the pick. I don't know of any other edge in this class that's doing that. That is a ridiculous play, not just for an edge rusher, but for any linebacker to make. And I think that was the first play that I saw that really made me think, okay, this could potentially be like a Kyle Van Noy type of player, but with a jetpack on. That is the type of role that I think he would succeed in, and he has more than enough talent to do that. Now, are there a bunch of defenses in the NFL that even have that type of role for him to fill? Not really. I think that, maybe there's 10 or 11 systems in the league where I think he could kind of be that hybrid off-ball / edge. It's not that common of a role, but it does exist, and I think that out of all the guys in this class that could play that role, Yasir Abdullah is probably the best one. I think all of the teams that are in the general Vic Fangio tree, which like I said, there's a bunch of them now, I think they're all going to be really interested in Abdullah as a Sam backer because that's the exact type of profile they're looking for, and he will have a home somewhere between rounds 4 and 5. That's my best guess at least. Maybe he'll go earlier just because he's a freak of nature, but round 4 to 5 as a Sam backer with a ton of pass rush upside sounds about right, and I think that he is going to be a really, really good pro. All the tier 3 players, like I mentioned before, they're all the Robins, right? They're the complementary players, the role players. Tier 4 is where we start getting into Alfred, which means they're definitely an important part of the team, but I don't necessarily know what they're going to do from week to week. They might be like hyper-specific role players. They might be guys that I don't necessarily know how to project them right now. Maybe I think they could stand to lose some weight and switch positions. Maybe I think they could gain some weight and switch positions. Maybe there's somebody where they only fit like 3 or 4 teams in the league, but they fit those teams like a glove. These are all really tough players to grade because I don't quite know what to do with them yet. I know they're good, and their grade is very solid, but they're a little bit more hyper-specific, with the one exception maybe being like a Kenna Anachukwu from Rice, who's just like hit it down the middle of the fairway, you are a 4-3 defensive end. But pretty much all these other guys in this group, I don't really know what to do with them yet. I just know they're good. So without further ado, let's get to Tier 4. We're going to start off this tier by talking about the other Clemson pass rusher on that vaunted defensive line, KJ Henry. And fun fact, KJ Henry actually had the highest pass rush win rate on that defensive line. He was at 16.3%, while Miles Murphy was at 14.9%, and Brian Bresee was at 14.3%. So I guess from a numbers standpoint, KJ Henry was actually the most efficient pass rusher on the team. The reason, though, why I have him down at Tier 4 instead of being a lot higher in Tier 3 or Tier 2 is because he just doesn't have the same tools that a lot of the higher-ranked pass rushers have. He's not a bad athlete per se, but I don't think he's a very good athlete either. The way that KJ Henry wins is with technique and effort, and he's one of the more technically well-rounded pass rushers in this whole group. Where I really noticed him first was all the way back in week 1 when they were playing against Georgia Tech, when he was just beating the hell out of that GT right tackle. I'm pretty sure he's wanted for war crimes in like 14 countries at this point, because what he did was not okay to put on television. It was a rough watch if you were a GT fan. But that was really what put KJ Henry on my radar, at least that particular game, because he won in almost every way you can think of. There was a particularly nasty move he put on for a quarterback hit early in that game where he gave a one-arm stab that then turned into a push-pull in addition to kind of like a Euro step around to the edge. It was just nasty, I'm not going to lie. But I love seeing it. I love, seeing a young pass rusher have that kind of plan as a rusher and that kind of confidence to throw a really complex string of moves together. It's just not something you see from a lot of young rushers, because most young rushers don't really know how to do that type of stuff in terms of linking their hands to their feet, keeping their hips square to the quarterback. All stuff that like veteran pass rushers in the NFL do, but you just don't see a lot of college kids do that. So that was really encouraging to me, and a big reason why I still have him in Tier 4 despite his athletic limitations. And I think the fact that he is such a refined rusher and the fact that he is a very high effort player against the run, I think he's going to have a job in the NFL for a little while. I don't know how long he's going to last because, again, in the end, athleticism wins, but I think at least as a rookie and through his rookie contract, the fact that you don't really have to teach him a whole lot, the fact that you can get him in the room and you don't have to spend time developing him as like a 4th or 5th round pick is where he's likely going to go. I think that's valuable. I think you can just immediately throw him into the fire as a rotational rusher, and you can count on him to be at least a little bit productive. Do I ever predict him getting like 8+ sacks in a season? Probably not, but as a rotational pass rusher, you can do a lot worse than KJ Henry. I really do like him a lot. Now, moving on from Henry, we're going to go up to Michigan and look at the other Michigan pass rusher, and that's going to be Mike Morris, who was their stand-up rusher on the edge. They really like to put him in a 2-point stance out there, even though he's pretty damn big, but he typically rushed from a standing position. And I'll be honest, I don't really know what to do with him. He's kind of a weird profile in the sense that he's a bigger edge rusher. Keep in mind, he's 6'5", 275, so you would think, okay, there's a pretty easy comparison to like Rashawn Gary there, but no, he's nowhere near the athlete that Rashawn Gary was. He doesn't have the same power. He doesn't have the same burst or bend or really anything that Rashawn Gary had. His first step is just okay. His power is just fine. And he never really wins to the edge. He's one of the only edge rushers in this class that like 90% of his wins are inside counters or power rushes. Even Zach Harrison and Isaiah Foskey, like they had some wins to the edge, even though their hips are made of corded steel. That's how freaking stiff they are. Yeah, Mike Morris, he just doesn't win to the edge. It's just weird. He's a weird profile. Throw in the fact that he's not that good against the run, even though he's a really big dude. He just plays super high. He doesn't have great balance. He doesn't have great anchor. I don't know. I just don't know what to do with him. I recognize that there is upside there, and he was productive because he does have a really good inside counter. When he does actually play with good leverage and he gets under a tackle, he can generate some power and kind of collapse the pocket. There are some reps on tape that are genuinely exciting, but he's just not that athletic. He only wins in one way, and I don't really trust him as a run defender, even though he has the size for it. So I get it. There's going to be some coaches that are really excited about him because they think they can fix him, and I wish them luck. I think right now he's just a rotational guy for me. I wouldn't put him on the field on early downs. I don't trust him. And I think in terms of third down utility, I think he's best on, honestly, like stunts and games. Like that's what he does better than pretty much everything else. So yeah, I don't know. Weird profile. I thought about putting him in tier 5, but I recognized the upside, so I felt he was worth a tier 4 ranking. But I don't know what to do with him. But anyway, moving on, I want to go from Michigan all the way down to Stephen F. Austin now, because there is, in my opinion, a potential hidden gem there that not a whole lot of people are talking about, or not a whole lot of people are even aware of. I first saw him at the Shrine Bowl, and I had never heard of him before, but I have been really, really fascinated ever since. And that's B.J. Thompson, again, from Stephen F. Austin. If you're a Baylor fan, you probably recognize the name. He's a Baylor transfer from a few years ago now, and he is a much older prospect than most of the guys on this list, which is why I have him down in tier 4, because he is, I don't want to say old. I mean, I'm 31. He's a lot younger than me, but relative to NFL draft prospects and the age you expect, like 21, 22, he is kind of old. And for reference on how old, he was in the same recruiting class as Chase Young, who's now going into his 4th season in the NFL. So yeah, he's been around. He did 6 years in college. It is what it is. COVID happened. I get it. It kind of messed with some timelines for a lot of guys coming out, but that will play against him, potentially being a 24-year-old rookie. That's a reason why he may or may not drop. Now, that being said, he is a freak athlete. Like, absolutely one of the freakiest of the freaks that I have ever seen at edge rusher. He also has been on Bruce Feldman's freaks list, and keep in mind he's 6'5", 240 with an 11.3 broad jump, a 4.56 in the 40, a 40-inch vertical, and a 4.2 shuttle. He is just ridiculous as an athlete. And watching him at Shrine Bowl, I was blown away with how he moves. I got some slow-mo footage of him doing some drop drills, like when they were testing him out at linebacker, and he looks like a safety. Like, I swear to God, he looks like a safety. He just moves so differently than so many other edge rushers in this class. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that he's still really raw, despite spending 6 years in college, and the fact that he did spend 6 years in college, so he's on the older side, if it wasn't for that stuff, he would be seen as one of the most intriguing edge rushers in this class for coaching staffs to potentially mold. His athleticism is rare, even in a class full of rare athletes. Like, he's above almost all of them. And I do think that he's going to get his name called earlier than people expect, just because he has so many tools, and the fact that even if he doesn't entirely know how to rush right now, the fact that you can drop him into coverage and he looks good doing it, that's going to be good for him as well. Plus, he plays special teams too, and that doesn't hurt either. So just keep an eye out for B.J. Thompson, Stephen F. Austin. He's going to go somewhere on day 3. I have no idea where, but he's going to go somewhere on day 3, and he is going to be one of the most talked about players in training camp, at least among his future local media. That much, I think, is pretty fair to say, just because of how freaky he is. Now, next up, I want to talk about a pair of undersized pass rushers, and I'm going to talk about them together because, again, their profiles are virtually the same, and that's Nick Herbig from Wisconsin and Derek Parrish from Houston. Both of these guys are in a similar mold to Yasir Abdullah in the sense that in the pros, they're going to be a hybrid off-ball linebacker / edge. The reason why I have Abdullah slightly higher than them is because I trust Abdullah more in coverage, for obvious reasons. He put some crazy reps in coverage on tape, and I just feel better about him covering people on day one. But that being said, as pure pass rushers, Herbig and Parrish were just as good as Abdullah. Both of their first steps are phenomenal. They have incredible agility. They're very low to the ground because they're both pretty darn short, but honestly, that can cause a lot of problems for offensive tackles that are 6'5", 6'6", because a lot of them don't really have the ability to get low enough to really get their hands on a target that small. So if you talk to offensive tackles, sometimes they hate blocking short guys the most just because they present the smallest target area for a punch. And Herbig and Parrish, at least looking at their tape, they both kind of abuse the fact that they're small in order to be really good pass rushers. A lot of tackles just straight up couldn't touch them. And it's not like NFL tackles are any shorter. Like, they're also going to struggle with hitting a target that small in the league too, because a lot of these 6'5", 6'6" guys they can't bend enough to do it. In terms of projecting their pass rush utility in the NFL, I know a lot of people have concerns because, again, they're tiny. But looking at the success that, for example, Dennis Gardeck had in Arizona, he's 6 foot 232, and in the past, he's been a really, really efficient pass rusher for the Cardinals. I think it can work. I think there's a lot of really small edge rushers in the league that have shown it can work. I mean, hell, Hassan Reddick, who's not exactly a big guy himself, he was one of the best pass rushers in the entire league last year. So even if you are small, if you know how to use that lack of size, I guess, to your advantage, and you're really bendy and you're really fluid and you have exceptional short area quickness, which of course Parrish and Herbig do, I think it is possible for them to be really effective rushers at the next level. Again, I have them in tier 4 for a reason, under Abdullah, because I think Abdullah is better in coverage. But if we're just talking about a pure pass rusher role, I think these are two guys that you can pick up in the 5th round and give them snaps immediately and expect them to get some pretty good pressure numbers out of it. Next up, I want to go in virtually the opposite direction and talk about somebody who's really, really big in this edge class. And that's Dante Stills from West Virginia, who comes in at 6'3.5", 286. So he's a big, big dude, bigger than a lot of the edges in this class, at least in terms of bulk. And I know a lot of people are projecting him more on the defensive tackle side, and I totally understand that. He played 5 technique for the most part, or 4-eye, or 3 technique at West Virginia. They kind of moved him around a little bit. But at least watching him rush on tape, and in particular, there's one rep against Iowa State that really made me think this. In that rep against Iowa State, where they let him come off the edge as a true edge rusher, from a 2-point stance, mind you, he got a sack on that rep, and it made me think, okay, if he dropped from 286 to like 275, maybe 270, if they had him drop weight and convert to, say, outside linebacker, in a big outside linebacker mold like you see in Green Bay with Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith and Zadarius Smith, if we went that route, which has been proven to work in the past, I think he could be a legitimately great outside linebacker in that type of system. He wouldn't have to drop in coverage that much, but he would get to play from a 2-point stance, so he can use that size to just keep constant vision on the ball, which bigger outside linebackers like the Smith brothers, like Aiden Hutchinson up in Detroit, they have credited their improvements in run defense to playing from a 2-point stance because they can see the ball as it's snapped, so that's a huge advantage for a big guy to play from a standing position. He's going to play the run really well, and again, if you take off just a little bit of weight and you give him some of that explosiveness back, even at 286, he already had a 172 10-yard split. That is excellent at that size. Like, really, really good at that size. I just think there's something there. I think you can convert him. I don't think he has to play 5 technique, even though he could. Like, I fully admit he absolutely could be a 5 technique in the league, but I think his highest ceiling is at edge. If we drop a little bit of weight, we put him on the Zadarius Smith or Preston Smith path, and we just let him play that role. I think that's where he would be best. I fully understand that it's unlikely that this happens, but that's just my vision for him. And I do wish him best of luck wherever he goes. We talked to him a little bit at the Shrine Bowl. He's a great dude, really good in the locker room, excellent leader, one of the most productive West Virginia players ever. He's a really, really good guy. So I wish him all the best, and hopefully he goes to a good team. Now, from there, we're going to go to another one of my favorite underrated pass rushers in this class, Ikenna Enechukwu from Rice. Again, also talked to him at the Shrine Bowl. Great dude, wonderful to talk to. Whatever locker room he goes to is going to absolutely fall in love with him. But beyond just being a good dude, he is a fucking nightmare to block on the field. I understand he hasn't gotten a lot of press, and that's, for a reason. He went to Rice. Not everybody has access to Rice tape, but I do, and I watched it, and let me tell you right now, he is really, really good. You watch him against USC, one of the best offenses in the entire country, and they could not handle him. He was way too physical, way too strong. His motor never stops. I mean, he was just running around like a freaking maniac. Caleb Williams was running for his life against Enechukwu. They could not handle his power. They could not handle his length. That was the game that really solidified for me that he's going to go somewhere like starting in the 4th round probably. Like, I would not be shocked if he got taken in the 4th round, maybe 5th or 6th at the latest, but I'm a huge fan of Ikenna Enechukwu. He plays the run really well, which at his size you kind of expect. He's 265 pounds with long arms, super strong at the point of attack. But the fact that he could rush from a 9, from a 6, from a 5, they even put him at 3 technique sometimes. He was effective at every single spot. I think that whatever system you want to throw him into, you can throw him into it and he's going to be totally fine. As for why I have him in tier 4, even though I am just heaping tons of praise on him right now, obviously level of competition is a little bit of a concern. We didn't get to see too many games against top schools, even though he performed well against USC. There wasn't a whole lot of other top-tier programs that we got to see him go against. So he's a quote-unquote unproven talent, but he played well at Shrine Bowl. He played well against the Trojans. He has a lot of talent. I'm a believer that there's something there. And maybe to a degree, he's a victim of the fact that this edge class is so insanely deep that there's a bunch of other guys that have more proven resumes. But I'll be damned. I really, really do want him to stay in Houston and go with the Texans and, be in that D'Amico Ryans defense. I think they would love him there. I think he would be awesome there. And, maybe my Texans fan bias is showing, but I love this kid. He's great. Now, moving from Enechukwu, we're going to go to our 3rd straight Shrine Bowl player. And obviously, we had a very deep defensive line group in Shrine Bowl this year. I didn't get to go to the Senior Bowl, which also had an insanely deep defensive line group, but all these last 3 guys I got to watch up close and personal in Vegas, and they were all really impressive. But Desjuan Johnson was probably the most impressive out of all of them that week at practice. And if you've listened to us talk about him endlessly for the last 3 months, I mean, it's for good reason. He's a really good penetrating, hybrid inside-outside player. And I'll be honest, I probably should have put him in the defensive tackle rankings because I think he's going to end up playing a very similar role to Kalijah Kancey and also to Adetomiwa Adebaware from Northwestern and Brian Bresee from Clemson. Kind of playing that base defensive end on early downs, or if you're in an odd front, he'd play 5 technique. And then when you get into passing downs, like 3rd and 7 plus, kick him inside to 3 technique and have him rush as an interior pass rusher. He'd probably end up playing the same role as those guys, so maybe I should have put him with the DTs, but I just kind of felt better putting him with the edges just because of his build. He looks more like an edge than like a DT to me, but not that it really matters. It's the same role. But anyway, in terms of looking at his film, he was one of the most active interior/exterior hybrid guys in this class. And what I mean by that was he was in the backfield all the damn time, like constantly in the backfield. He's really quick laterally, really fluid. I think you could leave him outside, like as a defensive end on passing downs, and he could still win against tackles. I don't know if I could say the same thing about Bresee or Adebaware. I think Desjuan Johnson's just a more natural pass rusher, at least out on the edge. Inside, they're all good, but out on the edge, I think he's a more natural pass rusher there. But when you get him inside and he's matched up against like slower-footed guards, he's so damn quick, and it's just not a fair fight. He's a very, very gifted interior penetrator. And before you go off, looking at his pro day numbers, trust me, those are not real. Like, he is so much more athletic than the pro day numbers suggest. And the tape backs that up too. Like, he is so damn quick, so slippery, and he's somebody who I think a lot of defensive line coaches would love to have as a club in their bag on third down, simply because he has the athleticism to do things that a lot of other interior rushers can't do. If you want to run a 3-man game and have him as a looper, like all the way to the opposite edge from a 3 technique, he can do it. Like, he can get there in time, he can close on the quarterback, he can bend, he can flatten, he can do all that stuff. Or if you want him to be the one that sets up the pins and have everybody else knock him down, he can do that too. He's got the power for that. He can displace blockers and kind of create that lane. He's just a very versatile player and somebody who I personally really do believe in. I trust the tape on this one more than I trust the pro day numbers. I don't know if it's because of weather or an injury or something like that, but I had heard prior to the pro day that his numbers were going to be a lot better than that, especially coming from pre-pro day training. So I still haven't gotten an answer about what the hell happened there, but he's a better athlete than that testing suggests. Just trust me on that. I have no idea where he's going to go because, again, he's a tweener from Toledo, and that type of profile typically doesn't get drafted very high, but I think he's going to have a very solid career and be another one of these complimentary pass rushers that you're going to get on day 3. And then, next thing you know, you look up and he's been playing for 7 years. So very, very solid player. And then we're going to round off this tier and close it out with one more name who I also don't really know what to do with him, and that's Andre Carter from Army. Just like Desjuan Johnson, the tape and the testing numbers just don't match up. Like, he looks way more athletic on tape than his testing numbers suggest. And just to read off those numbers to you real quick, he had a vertical of 30 inches. He only put up 9.1 in the broad. As a 6'6", 260-pound edge rusher, he ran 4.86. And really the only positive numbers that he put up were his 3-cone, where he ran it in 6.86, which is excellent, and 4.33 on the shuttle, which is also excellent. So at least that number kind of checked out. But if you look at him on tape, the vertical and the broad in particular made no sense to me. Like, his first step was way better than a vertical of 30 would suggest. So, maybe it's the fact that he went to Army. Like, maybe he didn't get as much or any time to really train for a pro day. I'm not really sure what goes into training for the NFL for Service Academy players, but just looking at him on tape, he is such a better athlete than his RAS would suggest. So I'm kind of trusting my eyes on that one. I'm trusting what we all saw, which is a very, very athletic 6'6", 260-pound stand-up linebacker with great bend, great agility, great power, great first step. There's something to work with there. Just like a lot of the Shrine Bowl guys, I have no idea where he's going to get drafted, like Desjuan and McKenna and Dante Stills. Like, it really just depends on team fit, and if they believe in the tape just like I do, he could slip into day 3, and I would fully understand why. But just going off of tape, he is a much more toolsy edge rusher than I think he gets given credit for. He was somebody who was seen, potentially as a top 50 pick in the middle of the season. And that's for a reason. Like, he was dominating everybody. It's not like we can just forget that he was a dominant edge rusher. We can't just ignore that he was killing every single offensive tackle in front of him. We all saw it. We all have eyes. We know he's a good athlete. So again, I don't know where he's going to go. I have him in tier 4 simply because I don't know what to do with this, because there's such a disparity between testing numbers and tape. I'm just leaning on the side of trusting the tape and trusting that he's going to go somewhere in the top 150. I don't know how high, but I think he deserves it. Like, I think the tape is good enough that he should be picked in the top 150, and you just figure it out. Again, he's 6'6", 260 with really good athleticism. If your defensive line coach can't do something with that, then get a new one. All right, we're finally here. This is tier 5. And, kind of looking at these names off on my side monitor here, how I could best describe this tier is they're not bad players. I just have a lot more significant questions or concerns about these players than I do about the ones in tier 4. I might not know what to do with a lot of the guys from tier 4, but I don't necessarily question their talent or level of competition, anything like that. Like, I at least have some more answers on them than with tier 5, where I either have like significant concerns about talent level or significant concerns about competition level, and so I just couldn't really justify putting them in tier 4. Again, it's kind of a weird group and a weird way to phrase it, because they're not bad players. They're all going to be drafted. They're all going to be on teams next year. I just had to draw the line somewhere, and these are the ones that ended up in tier 5. So, let's talk about them, and I'll kind of expand on that, because I know it sounds like I'm being super negative, and I want to talk about what they do well, and then, maybe we'll figure out valuation down the line. But with that being said, let's get to tier 5. We're going to start off this tier by talking about somebody who I don't think has gotten any press at all in the pre-draft cycle, and that's Caleb Murphy from Ferris State. He is one of only 3 non-D1 players to get a combine invite this year, and he absolutely earned that invite as a conference player of the year down at Ferris State. He had a whole bunch of production, 13 sacks, 27 tackles for loss, was probably the best edge rusher in all of D2 last year. And he's somebody who I think teams will definitely look at late in day 3 as, just kind of an edge rusher flyer, somebody who might play some special teams for him. He's got kind of an interesting profile because, again, he's one of the shorter, stockier guys. He's 6'3", 255. And even though he isn't the most explosive jumper, he had less than a 30-inch vert, which is not good. I think looking at his 10 split, which was pretty decent at 165, I think that's more representative of what his first step is. I think his first step is really underrated. He's really good at converting speed to power. He does have a wrestling background a little bit, which I think, again, shows up in terms of contact balance and how he's able to use leverage against taller tackles. He also played basketball. He played baseball. He was in track. And I think that kind of diverse athletic background is really only a benefit for him. I think he's got good feet, good balance. Even though he didn't test outrageously well in the 3-cone, I think his bend is a lot better than, maybe he gets credit for. And keep in mind that with a D2 player that's likely to go late on day 3, maybe priority UDFA, it's possible that he just didn't have, the combine trading infrastructure that a lot of other guys have. So he didn't time as well as, maybe a lot of other guys in this class. It doesn't mean that he's not a good football player. I do think that he is a good player. He absolutely earned being in the discussion for a day 3 rotational pass rusher. And at the end of the day, teams are just trying to find good ball players. Like, they don't necessarily prioritize athleticism first for everybody, because if your film is good and if you're really productive and you're really good in meeting rooms and, you're great off the field, you're going to have a job somewhere. And Caleb Murphy checks all of those other boxes other than elite athleticism. So I really do like him a lot. He had a great week down at the Shrine Bowl. That's where I first kind of put him on my radar. And then digging more and more into him, I just became more intrigued by the potential that he has. So definitely somebody to keep on your radar as a D2 player in this class. And moving on from Murphy, I want to talk about Carl Brooks from Bowling Green, another quote-unquote small school guy in this group. And Carl Brooks might be one of the most unique edge profiles that I've ever seen because he's 300 pounds. I'm not kidding. He is literally a 300-pound stand-up edge rusher, which I don't think I've ever seen that before, let alone a 300-pound edge rusher who's only like 6'3.5" with 31.5-inch arms. So from like a physical build perspective, he's a one of one. And I don't necessarily mean that in like a unicorn type way. I've just literally never seen a profile like him. But I'll be damned, just like Caleb Murphy, the tape is really, really good. He's got way better bend than you expect. He's got better balance. He corners really well. He's got good hand usage. He's got good speed to power. There's definitely something there with Carl Brooks. Like, he didn't just luck his way into all the production that he had. He had a lot of really good, solid pass rush wins. And I do think that if he's going to stick in the league, obviously he won't be at 300 pounds. He'll probably slim down to like 275, 280. But if you do slim him down to 275, 280, kind of like Dante Stills, or rather he'd be slimming down to Dante Stills' size. But if you take some of that weight off, I do think that you would get some explosion back. and all of a sudden you're looking at a bigger body edge rusher with even more twitch than he has now, with great bend, great balance, great cornering ability, a wide variety of moves. Again, I'm not advocating on drafting him super early. He's probably going to be like a 7th round pick, maybe a late 6th round pick if you really like him, but I don't know. There's something there. The film was good enough that I'm willing to take a chance in the middle to late of day 3, maybe even a priority UDFA. I'm just willing to take a chance on the film because the film is really good. He is not a physical profile that has ever existed in the NFL, and that's, I guess, a concern, but hey, there's a first time for everything. Maybe it'll work. And from there, moving on from a couple small school guys, let's go to one of the biggest programs out there at Ole Miss and talk about Tavius Robinson. And again, he's another interesting physical profile because he's about 6'6", 260, which is great. Just under 34-inch arms. Again, also great. We love that length. Vertical is relatively average, about 33.5, 10-foot broad. That's awesome. 1.58 10-yard split, which that shows up on film. Pretty good first step. But he also has some of the worst bend that I've ever seen. Like, it's a 7.43 cone. There's really no way around it. Even looking at it on film, this dude doesn't bend. He just rushes straight up and down. Very little contact balance. Doesn't really corner that well. He's got a great first step. He's got speed to power. He's got length. He's got all that stuff. But in terms of asking him to dip and rip around the edge, he's just never going to do that. So for me, he's like a more extreme version of Isaiah Foskey and Zach Harrison. But even those guys have better bend compared to Tavius Robinson. He is absolutely a one-dimensional pass rusher. He's a one-trick pony. I mean, it's a good trick. Don't get me wrong. It's a great trick. But it is a one-trick pony to me. So that's why I have him at tier 5. He'll have a job in the league. He'll be a rotational pass rusher somewhere. But personally, for me, I think his developmental ceiling is a lot lower because of that lack of bend than, say, a lot of the tier 4 guys like KJ Henry, Ekene Anachukwu, Dante Stills, BJ Thompson, all those guys. I just think that they have a higher potential than Tavius Robinson because he just can't frickin' bend. And it's a pretty similar story to our next tier 5 edge rusher, and that's Colby Wooden out of Auburn, who, you know, maybe I should have put with the defensive tackle rankings similar to Desjuan Johnson because he'll end up playing a similar role to not just Desjuan Johnson, but also Adebawore and Bresee and all these other kind of like hybrid DT edges where you're playing defensive end on early downs, maybe kicking inside to rush the passer against a guard. And he's going to be rushing against guards and not tackles because I just don't think he can win against tackles. He just doesn't have the bend for it. It's very similar to Tavius Robinson, like I mentioned, where he's got a good first step. A 1.63 10-yard split absolutely shows up on tape. I think he's a very linear, explosive, straight line athlete. But if you're asking him to win late in the rep, meaning you're getting pushed to the back of the pocket, you got to really get low, have contact balance, have bend, be able to flip your hips while being pushed and kind of have that bend to flatten around the corner and finish the sack. He can't do that. So he's either going to win early in the rep or he's not going to win at all because he just can't win late with bend. And you can't win late without bend. It's just not going to happen. So just like Tavius Robinson, I see him as a more extreme version of Zach Harrison and Isaiah Foskey. Not that Harrison and Foskey have great bend themselves, but it's at least better than Colby Wooden. He, just like Robinson, is pretty much just straight up and down. So I see a similar type of role for him where he's playing defensive end on early downs, kicking inside and, you know, maybe rushing the passer against a guard. But even against a guard, that lack of bend is going to give him trouble too. So again, late 6th, early 7th-ish round is kind of where I expect him to go. He's a rotational player to me, maybe a special teams player to me. I want to emphasize that, again, he's going to have a job. I just don't necessarily have super high expectations for his ceiling compared to a lot of the guys in early tiers. Doesn't make him a bad player. I'm just being realistic. And then we're going to round off tier 5 with 2 more edges that I think have, late day 3, kind of borderline draftable grades. And that's going to be Brenton Cox Jr. from Florida and Robert Beal Jr. from Georgia. Neither of these guys are special athletes at all. That's kind of a theme that we see with Tier 5 edges, is now we're starting to get into guys that don't have an athletic profile that you can really bank on, so you got to look at other stuff. And I think that, what makes them draftable to me is effort. It's the ability to play with power. It's the ability to play the run. It's the ability to play special teams. I do think that both Cox and Beal are very high effort players. They play their responsibility. They play the run. They can contribute as pass rushers, even though that's probably not what their strength is going to be in the NFL. I think they're more rotational edge rushers. I don't have super high expectations for them as a pass rusher, but I just love that they play hard. They play their assignments. They will play special teams. From what I can gather, this is more so with Cox than Beal. From what I can gather, Brenton Cox does not have any sort of football character concerns. I know that people, see when you get kicked off 2 teams in the SEC in like 3 years, they're like, okay, well, what's wrong with you? From people I've talked to, there's nothing really wrong. He never did anything illegal. He never got into trouble off the field. It was just, some personality conflicts with the coaching staff. And that's going to happen. It doesn't make him a bad guy. It doesn't make him somebody who's not worthy of being in the NFL. I personally don't have any character concerns with Brenton Cox based on the research that I have access to, I guess is the best way to put it. So, yeah, he got dismissed from 2 programs, but it wasn't for anything that you would expect, I guess. It's just a personality conflict. Not a crime, not a bad guy, just a personality thing. Anyway, hopefully that cleared some things up. But in terms of football character, he tries really hard. He's a high-effort player. No concerns about that whatsoever. And Robert Beal, again, same thing. Super high football character and somebody who I would want to have in the locker room as well. Again, these guys are going to go probably in the 7th round. Maybe they'll be priority UDFAs. We're kind of running out of draftable grades here, but this is the last grouping that I felt comfortable drafting, at least, if I needed an edge rusher on day 3. All right, that'll do it for today. If you're still here in this episode, for one, thank you. Really appreciate that. The algorithm gods also thank you. Make sure to leave a like and a comment and subscribe and hit the bell and all that stuff. By the way, every single YouTube consultant that I've ever chatted with always says, oh, you should do a call to action and ask for subscriptions and likes and stuff like that. I don't even know if that works. My general mindset is if the content's shit, you probably left half hour ago anyway, And if you like it, you'll probably subscribe. We're all adults here. So if you liked it and you're not already subscribed, maybe consider doing that if you don't hate me. And if you didn't like it, what are you still doing here, dude? Are you a masochist? Are you hate watching me? Can you tell that I'm down to half bottle of wine while recording this? Anyway, next week's episode is linebackers. That one should be a lot shorter because there's a lot fewer linebackers in this class that I actually enjoy watching play football. Some of them are... There's some bad linebackers in this class, guys. Okay, real talk. There's some really bad linebackers in this class. It's not a horrible class, but the peaks are good and the valleys are fucking shit. So yeah, that episode's going to be a lot shorter. There's a lot less good guys or good linebackers. That'll be out next week sometime. So I don't know. I'll see you guys very soon for that. And until then, cheers.